Always curious, Professor George Washington Carver committed his life to scholarship, community, and the integration of his Christian faith with higher education. It's in this spirit we welcome you to Carver Classrooms.
Hello and welcome back to this Carver Classrooms course on poetry and the church. Today we're going to talk through a few tips on how to begin reading poetry. And here's my very sophisticated answer. This is after many years of studying poetry and learning about poetry. This is the answer I give. Just start. Just open a book of poems and start reading. Some people begin at the beginning of a book of poems. Some people skip to the middle. Some people look around for a title that seems interesting. It doesn't really matter. Poetry is just sitting there ready to be read. There are all kinds of great anthologies you might like. Dover sells a little book of the 100 most loved poems. You could start with that. You could start with an anthology of poetry about joy or home or gratitude. You could start with Kevin Young's incredible collection of African-American poetry over 250 years. Wherever it is, whatever it is, just open a book of poems and start reading. And as you do so, you'll see that you'll encounter lots of different things, lots of different experiences. One of the experiences you'll encounter is most likely boredom. You'll also probably encounter confusion. These things happen. They also happen, by the way, when we read novels or memoirs or anything else. It's very normal. We don't need to expect so much out of every poem. Just keep reading. There are poems out there of every kind, rhymed and unrhymed, short and long, on every conceivable topic. And if you just keep reading, you're bound to run into a poem that seems like it has been written just for you. It's going to identify you. It's going to recognize you. It's going to challenge you. It's going to move you. And when you run into that poem, that's the poem where you start. That's the poem that inaugurates you into what this whole world of poetry can really do. Once you've found the poem that's really moved you or met you, then do this funny thing with it. Share it with a friend. Do this in a group. Find a Sunday school class or an adult education hour or something. Begin to write down the poems that you love and ask other people about the poems that they love and that they enjoy or that met them somehow. Poetry seems like it's a very private sort of thing, but in fact, poetry is all about a crowd. It craves a conversation. It wants to open up the many different ways that poetry can be experienced by all different readers. As you enter into the world of poetry, I have one key tip for you. Don't worry what others think. Sometimes we come out of school and we think, oh, we've got to understand the big poets or the great poets or the ones that I just don't understand. But in fact, poetry can be simple, it can be plain, it can be funny, it could be deep, it could be serious, it could be anything. Whatever it is, you want to find the poetry that you enjoy, the poems that move you. Start with those. Those are the best place to start. The great poet W.H. Auden, who was surely a genius himself, knew this as well. He himself describes entering into the art of poetry this way. He says he's discovered that poetry does not have to be great or even serious to be good. A person who has just entered poetry, he writes, begins to learn that poetry is more various than he imagined and that he can like and dislike different poems for different reasons. Okay, so that's how we begin to read. We begin to read by just reading. But what if we want to know more about poetry? What if we do want to know how these different poems work? What kinds of questions can we ask? And what follows, I want to lay out a series of questions that you can ask of any poem to begin a conversation about how it works. First, how does the grammar work in this poem? Where are the periods? Where are the commas? Poets still use grammar. They write sentences for the most part. And we can look at where those sentences begin and end. Do they extend across stanzas? Do they end at the end of any line? Where do they go with the grammar? And how does it work for or against the lines and stanzas of the poem? That's one easy place to start. What's the grammar of this poem actually doing? Second, how are the lines working? A line is a unit of thought. We don't often end or pause when we read at the end of every line, but a line is a unit of thought. And the length of a line can often convey a great deal of information. Walt Whitman, who wanted to convey this great expansive sense of America, used huge expansive lines. William Carlos Williams, who wanted you to pay attention to ordinary things, used very short lines so that your attention would be heightened by this very short expression on each given line. So how do the lines work? Third, how do the stanzas work? Stanza is actually Italian, and it means room or a little room. So how do the rooms of this poem work? How do the stanzas of this poem work? And what connects them to each other? Think about the rooms of a house. Each room has its own function, a dining room, a living room, a kitchen, or the different bedrooms. And usually something connects these rooms to each other, a hallway or something else. And so we can ask, what connects one room to each other? But also, how does each individual room work? Fourth, what is the music of this poem? What are the sounds of this poem? Are they hard sounds, soft sounds, fast sounds, slow sounds? Do they rhyme? Do they not rhyme? What is the poet trying to achieve with the many different sounds that go on through the course of the poem? Fifth, why does the poem even keep going? There's a lot of poetry that doesn't necessarily have to keep going. So what do the additional lines add? How do they turn the poem? How do they transform the poem? Why doesn't the poem stop sooner? It's a very simple question, but it actually allows you to see that each word is necessary, each line is necessary, each addition transforms what has come before. And finally, what is the form of this poem? We might think about traditional forms like sonnets and villanelles and all that, and any of that can be looked up for exactly how these rules and procedures work for these different forms. But one basic way to think about form is that it is, in fact, a container. Each poem is shaped like a physical container, and containers have different functions. Think about containers. Pitchers versus Tupperwares have very different forms and very different functions. So how does the form of this poem enable it to function in this kind of way? To get at some of these questions and how they work, I want to read one poem, one of my all-time favorite poems, and ask how it works using some of these simple questions. This is a poem called Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Now, with this poem, we can ask any number of the questions that I've already given you to think about. We can ask how the lines are working and so forth, but I want to begin with the stanzas. This is a poem of 3 stanzas, and the first question to ask is what connects them and how they're working independently. To look at what connects them, think about the repetitions in this poem. There's only one word that gets repeated in each of the 3 stanzas, and that word is cold. In the first stanza, the cold is blue-black. In the second stanza, it's splintering. And by the third stanza, it's driven out. And so each of the stanzas performs a certain kind of function in relation to the cold, which of course literally speaks about the cold of the house, but also speaks about the relationship between this father and this son, and the son reflecting on it over the years and beginning to understand how this father loved him, even though he never could express it, even though there were chronic angers in this house. So look to the repetitions, look to the word cold, but also think about other ways that this poem moves from beginning to end. Think about, for example, the sounds, the music of the poem. What sounds in this poem repeat? Start with the sound of that word to in the first line. Notice that it gets picked up by blue-black. But also notice that that word blue-black introduces a new sound that then gets repeated in the next line with the word cracked. That word cracked then leads into the word ached, and that long A sound takes us through labor, made, blaze. Mixed into those sounds is another one, banked, which then gets repeated at the end of the stanza with the word thanked. Okay, what of it? What do we make of all this music, all this sound, all these repetitions and rhymes? Well, on the one hand, we could just say it's beautiful. It's music. It's there to be beautiful, and that's it. And that's enough. But if we wanted to say more about it, we might point out the way that these sounds are, in a certain sense, passing on the baton to the next sound, which then takes it up and passes it on to the next sound, and so on down through the poem. And this is a poem about fathers and sons. It's a generational poem. It's about what gets passed down. And so the sounds are themselves producing that experience of something being passed on, handed down through the poem from one line to the next. But just as importantly, these sounds slow us down or speed us up. I love to do this experiment when I teach this poem. I have students say the words, made, banked, fires, blaze. And then I ask them, okay, say that phrase as fast as you possibly can. You could try it now. How fast can you say the phrase, made, banked, fires, blaze? Okay, not that fast. Those long A's slow us down. The words stop us. It's just not that easy to do. Well, what is that describing? It's describing how hard and how long it took this father to make banked fires blaze, to build the fire in the morning. What follows immediately after that? A phrase that is very speedy, very quick. No one ever thanked him. How fast can you say that phrase? No one ever thanked him. And notice what that phrase is about. It's about not observing. It's about being indifferent. It's about moving past without seeing what this father has done. So the speed of the lines built into the language itself are conveying the experience that is being discussed. Finally, think about how sounds convey experiences in another way. There's a great experiment from back in the day where these psychologists, I believe it was, put two shapes in front of people. One had a lot of angles, one had a lot of curvy shapes, and then they gave them two completely made-up words. One was the word kiki, and one was the word boba. And they asked people all over, okay, which shape is kiki and which shape is boba? Just name them. And lo and behold, it will not surprise you, that there was an incredible amount of consistency. The angled shapes, the sharp shapes, were called kiki, and the soft, round shapes were called boba. Why is that? These words are entirely made up. They don't actually have meaning. They're just made up names. Well, it's because the language itself conveys experiences. The language itself can be harsh. The language itself can be soft. And if you look at what happens in the language of this poem, we move from harsh sounds like ached and cracked to soft sounds like warm and room and slowly. And so the thawing of the relationship happens within the sounds of the language itself. Now, there are lots more questions we could ask. We could ask, for example, about the form of this poem. This poem is a sonnet, even though it doesn't look like any traditional sonnet. A sonnet has 14 lines in it and a certain kind of rhyme scheme that this sonnet doesn't have. And you could look up all of the rules and procedures for all the many kinds of forms that exist. But one thing you should know, the more rules that exist, the more poets love to bend and break those rules to produce meaning. And you get that here in the Haydn poem itself, which is a sonnet, though it has nothing of the usual forms and procedures of a regular sonnet. So forms are containers, they produce experiences, and you can know about them as much as you want to know about them, but you can also experience a poem without knowing anything about what a sonnet is or a villanelle or anything else. Now, sometimes poems have shapes and containers that are very obvious, and these are called concrete poems. And concrete poems are a good way to enter into thinking about what does a form of a poem or a container of a poem actually attempt to achieve. A concrete poem looks like what it's about. And to give you an example, I want to read an Easter poem by the great poet George Herbert from back in the 1600s. This is a poem called Easter Wings. Easter Wings. Lord, who createst man and wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more till he became most poor. With thee, O let me rise as larks harmoniously, and sing this day thy victories, then shall the fall further the flight in me. My tender age and sorrow did begin, and still with sicknesses and shame, thou didst so punish sin that I became most thin. With thee, let me combine and feel thy victory, for if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. This is a poem about decaying, about growing thin. And lo and behold, what do the lines do? They grow thin, as the poet does. And then it's a poem about rising with Christ. There's only one phrase repeated in both stanzas, with thee. And it's at the moment of the thinnest line, with thee. That's a line unto itself. And with Christ, the poet rises again, and the lines become longer and longer. But also, here's a little trick. If you turn the page on its sides, what do you see? Wings. It's like a child who is laid in the snow and beaten wings like an angel into the snow. There are wings in this poem. The poem is shaped like what it describes. Now, this is a very simple way to understand the shape and the container of poems and how the container affects the meaning. But all poems do this, and all poets think about this. They all are interested in the way that the form and the shape and the container conveys the experience they hope to convey. So in today's session, I hope to have laid out for you some ways that you can enter into the world of poetry and ask questions about it to understand a little bit better how it works. But again, we're only going to do that if we want to do that, if poetry has already drawn us in and initiated a conversation. In the next session, we're going to ask why we might want to enter into the world of poetry and what it has to offer to the church.